Railways are a great way of moving things around, be it people, freight, or the post. Most railways run a mix of passenger trains and goods trains on the same tracks, but some railway lines are built exclusively for certain types of traffic, such as the slate mine railways of Wales or the logging railways of America and Australia. There was also once a railway built entirely to run a slightly more macabre type of railway service. In the 1850s, London was facing a weird crisis. The population of the city had rapidly increased from just under 1 million people to almost 2.5 million in the span of 50 years, and as a result, the 300 acres of graveyard space spread around the city was at full capacity. By 1842, an investigation showed that it was nearly impossible to dig a new grave without cutting through an existing one. People were either being buried on top of each other or simply dug up for someone else's body to be put in the grave. An outbreak of cholera in 1848 ended up killing an additional 14,600 people, whose bodies were left stacked in heaps while graves were being dug up for them to be put in. On top of this, the amount of rotting corpses was starting to contaminate the water supply, further spreading disease. Something had to be done, and so a proposal was put forward by Sir Richard Brown and Richard Spire to purchase a large plot of land to be used as a graveyard 23 miles away from London to house the dead. The graveyard would also be far enough away from London that it would be out of the range of the city's projected growth. It was to be called Brookwood Cemetery and had enough space to accommodate 5,830,500 graves in a single layer. Of course, being so far away from London, there needed to be a way for the dead to be moved to the graveyard. This is where the idea got interesting. The London and South Western Railway had a line that passed the gravesite, and so it was proposed that a train service could carry the bodies and mourners to the burial site quickly, cheaply, and easily. The LSWR was concerned about what impact a funeral train would have on other railway services, but eventually promised the usage of one train per day. The Bishop of London at the time hated the idea of funeral trains as it felt it demeaned the dignity of the deceased, as those who were respected members of their communities would be carried alongside those who had led immoral lives to the site. On top of that, he naturally felt that a railway was incompatible with the solemnity of a Christian burial service. Eventually, the plan was passed by Parliament and the London Necropolis and National Mausoleum Company, or the LNC, was formed. After some discussion and consideration, the cemetery was divided into two sections by a road, one cemetery being serviced by the Southern Station for members of the Church of England and the other serviced by the Northern Station for nonconformists and members of other religions. The trains themselves were also separated, not only by class but by religion as well, to help prevent any upset caused by two conflicting backgrounds sharing the same compartment while grieving. The carriages were designed to accommodate all classes and beliefs, with the only real difference between them being the ornamentation on the doors. Fares were set for a fair price and never really raised with inflation, meaning it eventually became cheaper over time. The train only ran if there was a coffin or passengers waiting to use it. If there was only a single second or third class coffin waiting to be transported, the train would postpone its run until the next service. By 1900, Sunday train services were discontinued, and from 1902, daily trains no longer ran, and the service was only used when required. The railway was also used to help relocate some of London's other burial grounds during civil engineering projects and to help ease the congestion. The line travelling through the graveyard had to be constantly maintained as the poor quality of the soil, the reason the land was so cheap to buy in the first place, would rapidly deteriorate the wooden sleepers that the track laid on, meaning they had to be constantly replaced. Aside from that, the railway had little in the way of faults or accidents, simply running as a quiet little railway from London to Brookwood. When the line first opened, trains were mostly pulled by any engine the LSWR had to spare, but by the 1930s, Southern Rail had the route mostly worked by the M7 class tank engines formerly belonging to the LSWR. Most commonly though, it was engine number 255 pulling most of the trains. The original London terminus for the railway was demolished in 1902 to help expand the Waterloo line that ran above the station, but was moved to a different location. The line saw a steady decline in traffic as Southern Rail was running more frequent trains to Brookwood Station, but it wasn't until the Necropolis station was bombed in 1941 that it truly became irrelevant. A deal was made between the LNC and Southern Rail in 1946 whereby Southern Rail would take over funeral trains to Brookwood while the LNC sold off their old station, but held the rights to limit the number of funeral parties on any given train. This deal was soon made obsolete after Southern Rail became part of British Railways after nationalisation in 1947. New operating procedures meant coffins had to be carried separately from other cargo, lack of adequate rolling stock, lack of use, and the constant need to replace the graveyard track sleepers simply led British Rail to stop running the funeral services. Transportation of coffins and funeral parties by road soon took over, and the railway through the graveyard also no longer served a use. The stations in the graveyard were either abandoned or knocked down, and the line was eventually pulled up, with a short section of track and a plaque remaining to mark the site. All in all, the London Necropolis Railway was an interesting solution to a problem that lasted roughly 80 years. It was never exactly the spooky express that only the dead travel on, like some others call it, but it was a very interesting solution to the problem faced at the time that we'd never really get to see nowadays. If only it was still around today. I know there are many train enthusiasts that would have proudly boasted they would indeed ride until they died. Train delays are always annoying. There's nothing worse than buying a ticket and waiting for ages, only to be told you're going to be late for your appointment because of wet rails, the wrong kind of snow, or there just simply being a swan on the line. What might fascinate you, however, is that some trains have been delayed not due to technical issues, but because of paranormal interference. Ghosts appearing around railways and train stations aren't rare. Hell, I spent an entire month last year talking about ghost stories. But I'd like to also touch on a few ghosts that have actively interfered with railway operations. One of these spirits was seen around the 1850s on the Great Northern Railway. At the time, the GNR was operating services directly from King's Cross to Hitchin. One day, an engine's driver was going about his duty when a gentleman somehow stepped aboard the engine's footplate as it was travelling at speed through Hatfield Station. The driver described the figure as having the saddest face I ever came across. The eyes seemed to look you through and through, and on top of that I saw he was all in black. I was never so afraid in my life. Stranger still, the fireman said he saw nothing, despite the driver's fear. Then the figure seemed to indicate to the driver that he should stop the train. The driver felt compelled to do so and brought the train to a stop. What seemed to be a bout of madness on the driver's behalf, delaying a train for no reason, quickly turned into a miracle as it was found 2 trucks had broken away from a goods train ahead of them and had come to a stop in the middle of the line. Had this ghost not got the driver to stop, the train would have collided with them, causing quite a serious accident. It's not just England either, as similar stories of ghosts interrupting railway operations have been reported across the world, and not all ghosts were in the mood to help. In Japan, around the Meiji period, a story arose about drivers being harassed by mysterious illusions. I couldn't find specific details on the dates or location, but I believe this may have happened around Kamakura. Supposedly, a driver was travelling down the line late at night when they suddenly saw another train on the same line heading towards them. Naturally, they threw on the engine's brakes and braced for impact, only for the oncoming train to vanish into thin air. After telling the story, several other drivers reported the same experience, travelling along the line, seeing the oncoming train and slamming on the brakes, only for the train to disappear. One day, a driver, having heard the story, was making a journey along the line when he saw the oncoming train. Rather than stop, he continued on at full speed, believing it to be the illusion. His train met with the oncoming one and passed straight through it. Shortly after, the illusion seemed to stop, and a dead horse was found beside the line, seeming to have been there for some time. It's believed the horse was struck down by a train, and angry that the railway had destroyed its habitat, its spirit disguised itself as a train to mock the railway men that ran the line. The chief priest of the Kenshoji temple took pity on the horse, and built a mound to honour it. So, next time your train is delayed in future, whatever the case, just hope it isn't for supernatural reasons. Else, you may want to consider refunding your ticket. Moving dead bodies is always a hassle. In Australia, when the need arose to move many dead people out of Sydney, they felt the best and most respectable way to go about it was via railway. As Australia's cities began to get bigger and bigger, attention quickly turned to the matter of housing the dead. In Sydney in 1862, several smaller graveyards had to be closed, owing to either being too full or to make way for further development. Not wanting to end up like London at the time, where there was nowhere to bury the dead and bodies were piled high in the streets as a result, plans were put in place to establish a large cemetery just outside of the city. This way, there was plenty of guaranteed space to bury people while still allowing the city room to expand. The only problem was, how would coffins and mourners get to the cemetery from the middle of Sydney? Why, by train of course. A small branch line was built from Lidcombe railway station leading to the newly established Rookwood Cemetery. This way, bodies and anybody who wished to visit the site could ride the train to Lidcombe and from there be transported directly into the graveyard. The line was officially opened in 1865 and only travelled a short way into the cemetery grounds. A proper station was built soon afterwards in the cemetery in 1867, when it was decided that it would be easier and more dignified for a funeral to arrive at an actual train station instead of the plain timber and corrugated iron platform that was in place at the time. The station, named Necropolis, was built to resemble a church and even had a bell tower that was used for funerals and to inform passengers of departing trains. A system was later put in place to separate visitors from funeral services when arriving at the station. Another station was built on Regent Street near Sydney Central train station, known as the Mortuary Station. The idea was to have a station separate from the main central one for funeral trains specifically to depart from, so mourners and funeral parties could be granted a little more privacy. Later, as the cemetery started to fill up, the line was extended, with another station being built in 1897, and 2 more stations and further expansion was added in 1908, allowing for up to 4 trains to run on the line at one time. The stations were all eventually renamed Cemetery Stations number 1 through 4. None of them catered to any specific faith. However, some stations were more frequently used by certain religions, such as Station 2 as it was in the middle of the plot dedicated to Roman Catholics. Several small churches and other similar places of worship were built around Rookwood too, for Sunday services and for funerals. Services for visitors were regular, while funeral services had to be pre-arranged with the railway. The line was very heavily used, but worked as intended for many years without major incident. By the 1930s, however, usage of the railway had died down, and funeral services had all but ceased. The line from then on was primarily used to carry visitors on Sundays and during Mother's Day. Usage of the line increased during the Second World War as a result of petrol rationing, however it quickly dropped back down again once rationing was over. By 1948, the railway was officially closed to the public. Stations 2, 3 and 4 were demolished. However, Station 1 was given a new lease on life when it was instead disassembled and moved to Canberra, where it was reassembled and is now All Saints Church. The railway line itself still remained in use until the 1980s to transport stonework to the cemetery before finally being pulled up. In the end, Rookwood Cemetery Railway was a very surreal solution to the problem of transporting the dead. Not only did it involve building and running a fully functioning rail line through a graveyard, but the fact they went out of their way to make the infrastructure of the line itself fittingly Gothic and church-like too. It certainly must have been an interesting spectacle. Just make sure you booked a return trip before you got on. Else you might have ended up stuck on a platform with a few less than lively passengers. There have been many incidents and fatal accidents on Britain's railways, some much worse than others. But out of all of them, there's one disaster that perpetuates to this day. Not because of its death toll or because of its inherent tragedy, but because of the mystery of 2 unidentified passengers and an ominous woman in black. It was 5 AM on the 13th of October 1928. 4 trains were travelling along the Down Line from Gloucester to Bristol in the following order: a goods train belonging to the LMS, a goods train belonging to the GWR, a parcel train belonging to the LMS and a mail train carrying 60 passengers, also belonging to the LMS. As the faster parcel train took priority over the slower goods, it was decided the 2 goods trains would be shunted to make way for the parcel service. When the LMS goods reached Charfield Station, it was ordered to move to the down siding, while the Great Western goods was ordered to move into the siding of the Berkeley Road signal box, the box before Charfield. The parcel service passed by both without incident. However, when the Charfield signalman gave the all clear to the LMS goods train, it didn't move. The driver had chosen to spend an extra 5 minutes taking on water, something he wasn't booked to do. The original plan was to let both the LMS and GWR goods go once the parcel train had passed, but because of the delay taking on water, the GWR goods had caught up to the LMS goods. With a mail train fast approaching, the Charfield signalman was forced to shunt the Great Western goods into the siding once the LMS goods had gone. Meanwhile, on the mail train, driver E.H. Aldington Aldington asked fireman FC Want to look out for the down signal. Want wasn't experienced on this line, and as such didn't know where the signal would be. On top of this, a thick morning fog was starting to form, making it much harder to see ahead. As they approached the signal, Want claimed to have seen the signal light as green, meaning all clear, before continuing to fire the engine. What truly happened in that moment is a mystery. Mechanical fail-safes in place meant the signal could only be set to danger while the points to the siding were occupied, and as the GWR goods was still backing into place, it was impossible for the signal to be set to clear. If it was set to danger, the driver should have slowed down, ready to stop. Regardless, the fireman reported it as clear to the driver and the mail train didn't slow down as a result. The signalman was watching the GWR goods enter the siding when he noticed his track circuit change to occupied, indicating that the mail train was at the signal near the station, only to his horror see it quickly change back to clear, meaning it hadn't stopped. The two front vans, the engine and tender of the Great Western goods were still on the line when the mail train approached. The mail driver saw the goods engine and quickly slammed on the brakes and braced for impact. At the same time, an empty LMS goods train was travelling along the upline and had just cleared the bridge. At 20 minutes past 5 in the morning, the mail train collided with the goods engine. The mail engine scraped past the leading goods wagons and collided with the Great Western tender, shoving it into the embankment before hitting the engine, pinning it to the wall of the bridge arch and derailing. It was forced to the right and collided with wagons 9 and 10 of the empty goods train passing through the tunnel on the opposite side. Most of the goods wagons were relatively unscathed. The mail carriages, however, weren't quite as fortunate. The mail train was made up of several old travelling post office vans, a goods van and 4 old passenger coaches, making 11 carriages total. All of them were made up of wood, and all but 3 were still lit using gas lighting. The sudden deceleration made the front 2 vans and the front 2 passenger carriages violently telescope into each other, with the momentum forcing the frames on the forward 2 coaches to bend upwards and come to rest on the bridge wall. Part of the carriage roof and a passenger even ended up landing on top of the bridge. The driver and fireman of the empty goods train felt a sudden jerk, but didn't suspect anything, continuing up the line until they came to a signal ordering them to stop, where they discovered most of their train was missing. The crews of the goods and mail train were both injured but alive, while the guards of the 2 goods trains were thrown around their guards' vans due to the sudden stop. Unfortunately, the worst was yet to come. As locals gathered to help, gas from the carriages started to build up under the bridge, and soon ignited. The wreckage of the carriages and several of the empty goods wagons caught fire. Some reports from witnesses mentioned how they could hear passengers trapped in the wreckage call out for help. Some people even begged to have trapped limbs amputated to avoid burning to death. Lewis Huntley, who'd been travelling with his wife and widowed sister, recounted that his wife had jumped to safety, and he helped a few women free from a trapped compartment before trying to free his sister. His sister was trapped from the waist down and couldn't be freed before the fire reached her, and as such, Huntley had to leave her to die. The flames were said to be over 40 feet tall, and it took 5 hours for firefighters from Gloucester, Bristol and Stroud to get them under control. Author Tom Rolt reported that it took 12 hours for the fire to finally be extinguished. By the time the fire was put out, 7 of the mail train carriages were completely destroyed, along with 8 of the empty goods wagons and 2 of the loaded Great Western goods vans. Nobody's certain how many people were involved in the accident, with many believing 15 died and 23 were injured. However, the official report states 16 died and 41 were injured. It's unknown how many of the deceased died from the initial impact and how many died from the fire. Want and Aldington, who'd survived the ordeal, were put on trial for manslaughter. What's interesting about the case is that neither of them attempted to make excuses, and both solemnly swore that the signal light was green. And with Aldington having worked for the railway for 37 years, his word was taken seriously. Error on behalf of the signalman was completely ruled out, as the only way the signal could have shown green would have been if the signalling cables were weighed down or sabotaged, no evidence of which was ever found. What truly happened that morning still remains a mystery to this day. Further adding to the mystery around the crash were two unidentified victims, a young boy and girl, one aged between 4 and 7 and the other a teenager, who were unaccompanied on the train. All of the victims were identified apart from them, with nobody ever coming forward to claim the children despite a nationwide appeal. Rumours spread that there weren't any children involved when a local carpenter who made the coffins for the victims claimed the two small ones he had made were for any remains that couldn't be attributed to a specific individual. However, the official incident report does log 2 children as being found at the scene. Both were buried along with the other victims in a mass grave at St. James's Church nearby, with the LMS providing the headstone. All the victims' names are listed, with the children being marked as 2 unknown. It's said one woman came forward and claimed them to be her brothers, but the claim was never confirmed. Even more mysterious is the woman in black. After the accident, locals said an elderly woman in a black dress would come to visit the grave several times a year. She would arrive in a chauffeur-driven limousine, visit the grave for a short time and leave. Everyone who saw her said she had an air of sadness about her. Nobody knew who she was or what relation she had to any of the victims. She kept visiting from the year of the accident until the 1960s. Nobody has seen her since. As a result of her visits, many have come up with theories as to who the children were, with some suggesting she was adopting them, while others say that they'd ran away from home after a falling out. I could go on, but there are so many theories and there just isn't enough time in the day. In the end, the Charfield disaster is one of those few rare stories that's not only fascinating in the way that such tragic tales can be, but also surrounded in enough mystery to keep people guessing what really happened to this day. Was the signal green? Who were the unknown children? Who was the woman in black? Facts can only take us so far in such matters. Maybe one day someone will figure it all out. But in the meantime, all we can do is speculate. Ghosts aren't known for being punctual, even railroad ghosts. Part of what makes ghosts so mysterious is how rare they are to spot. So when a ghost started appearing around King William County in Virginia, it quickly became a hot spot for many ghost hunters and tourists, much to the annoyance of locals. Operated by the Norfolk Southern Railway, in the 1950s, the line travelling past the town of West Point was just like any other piece of railroad in the US when, one day, locals began to notice something. At the crossing where Mount Olive Cohoque Road crosses the railroad tracks, a mysterious ghostly yellow light could be occasionally seen floating its way down the line. Accounts of it differ. Some say it would move quickly in a straight line, others say it'd swing and sway like a lantern being carried. Most people only saw the light, but some have also described seeing the silhouette of a person behind it, though the shape is too vague to make out any specifics. What makes this ghost light more unique than others is how punctual it is, seeming to appear around the same-ish time of day rather than at random. Regardless, it soon became well known by residents of the town, and many theories as to how the mysterious light came to be have popped up over the years. The most common one is the headless brakeman, who was inspecting his train that had stopped on the line when it suddenly moved forwards, decapitating him, his spirit now wandering the line looking for his missing head. Another theory is that it's the light from a train full of Confederate soldiers who were being transported when they were ambushed by Union troops. Their souls linger on the line, having never reached their destination. And of course, another theory is aliens. One resident saying they saw the light and described it as bright as that of an arc welder, changing colours and dancing around before vanishing. Many have simply theorised that the light's appearance is due to swamp gases, but the relatively punctual nature of the light has put a lot of doubt on that hypothesis. There's been no recorded incident of a brakeman losing his head, and the Confederate soldier story has many loose ends, so what exactly is the cause of the light is still unknown. A car crash was recorded nearing the crossing that ended in the death of a mother and daughter, but again, many are unsure if that specific incident is the cause of the ghost light. What is known for sure is how much grief the local townsfolk and sheriff have went through, not directly because of the light, but from the amount of people that would come to see it. As word spread through the 70s and 80s of this ghost light that frequently appeared, people from all over the United States came to catch a glimpse of the mysterious spectacle. The sheriff would often have to shoo people away from the railroad, and even resorted to giving people tickets for trespassing on railroad property. It got so bad, people were reported firing shots at the light, which supposedly caused it to stop moving. Despite the attention, very few pictures of the light have been taken, and are difficult to find. As the years have passed, sightings of the light have become increasingly rare, and fewer people now travel to see it, much to the relief of the local police department. Some locals have said they miss the ghost, but regardless, I think you'll agree that whoever they were in life, they've certainly more than earned a name for themselves in death. Most railway ghosts aren't malicious. Sometimes they just pop up and give station porters a scare, while others are a warning or a bad omen for engine drivers. But for the most part, they usually don't cause much harm. In Japan, however, there's one ghost that's a little more bloodthirsty than its railway counterparts in the West. The exact origins of this ghost aren't quite known, but there are a few tellings of how it came to be. In the oldest version of the story, in post-World War II Hokkaido, an office worker named Kashima Riko was assaulted and violated by US military personnel. Distraught, she threw herself off a railway bridge that night and was cut in half by an oncoming train. She survived, but it was supposedly a cold night, which caused her arteries to close up, making her bleed slower. She had just enough strength to crawl to a nearby station, but rather than help, a station porter covered her with a tarp to hide her from passengers as she slowly bled out. Other versions of the story say it was a schoolgirl who fell on the line by accident, or that someone was pushed onto the tracks and subsequently bisected by a train. Kashima Ryako, however, seems to be the oldest version of this story. Regardless, those who have died in such a way are said to return as vengeful ghosts, appearing as legless bodies crawling along the ground on their hands and elbows. These spirits are known as teke teke after the sound they make as they drag themselves. Once you hear the story of the teke teke, it isn't long before they'll come for you. Some say they appear after 3 days, others a week, or some even a month. After they appear, they'll chase their target, and even though they're missing their legs, it's said they're able to keep pace with their victims, even ones that have tried to escape via car. Once caught, the teke teke's victims will be found missing their legs, either cut or torn off in a similar way to how the teke teke lost theirs. As such, most depictions of a teke teke show them carrying a scythe to cut their target with. The Kashima Reiko version of the ghost specifically is said to appear in bathroom stalls, asking occupants if they know where her legs are. Failure to give a satisfying answer usually leads to death. Telling the ghost they're on the Menshin Expressway or replying Kamen Shinin Ma supposedly is enough to ward off the spirit. Other teke teke ghosts might ask you if you need your legs, to which it's best to reply, I need them right now. Of course, this story is just an urban legend. That's why it can vary so much from place to place. But maybe let it be a reminder to be safe around trains, and also maybe not to take your legs for granted. Working conditions on many early US railroads were tough, especially those that were built along mountain ranges and steep terrain. These awkward, winding tracks were hard enough to navigate on their own, but for a while on the Denver and Rio Grande, they were made even more of a challenge in winter, not because of the weather, but because of harassment from ghosts. Completed in 1881, the narrow gauge line that ran through Marshall Pass in Colorado was an important part of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. The line carried goods and passengers alike, but its most notable service was the Shivano passenger train that it ran daily. During the late 1880s, however, drivers on the railroad became hesitant to work the route as more and more men began to report that they were being chased by a ghost train while traveling the pass, some even quitting because of it. One winter evening, driver Nelson Edwards and fireman Charles Whitehead were getting ready to work the Shavano as usual. Snow and ice on the line would make the journey difficult, a bridge along Marshall Pass was reported to be damaged, and a rail just afterwards was broken. But both were safe enough to cross over, provided the driver was careful, and Edwards was more than experienced enough to handle it. Setting off, the first leg of the journey went smoothly, but as the train passed through the first set of snow sheds, an engine whistle echoed from the distance. The bell in the driver's cab suddenly rang, meaning the conductor was signalling for the train to stop. Edwards carefully brought the train to a halt when the conductor ran up to the engine and demanded to know why they'd stopped. Edwards, confused, in turn asked why the conductor had signalled to stop the train. The conductor replied he'd done no such thing and anxiously told Edwards to get moving as a wild train was following behind and catching up. Wasting little time, the train was soon moving again, with Edwards and Whitehead working frantically to stay ahead of the chasing locomotive. Eventually, the pursuing locomotive came into view, and both men could see a white figure standing on top of the train gesturing wildly. Edwards charged through snowdrifts to stay ahead, and passengers were bumped and shaken about as the locomotive collided with the heavy piles of snow on the line. The passengers too were becoming anxious, as word spread of the wild train catching up to them. Accounts of the story differ slightly from here on. One version simply notes that when the pursuing engine was close enough, the mysterious driver leaned out of his cab and laughed, while another states that as both locomotives travelled through a passing loop, the chasing engine pulled up alongside. Regardless, both accounts state that Edwards got a good view of the crazed driver, saying his face was like dough. The chase continued on, both trains quickly approaching the damaged bridge and making it across without incident. Then, up ahead was the damaged rail. Accounts of the story again differ here. One version states that Edwards spotted a group of section workers on the tracks ahead and applied the brakes to avoid hitting them, only to skid right through them, vanishing as if they weren't there. Another says that Edwards spotted a waving red light ahead and applied the brakes, fearing he was about to hit the rear end of another train. Regardless, as soon as Edwards' train stopped, the pursuing train seemingly leapt from the tracks at the broken rail and plunged down the side of the mountain. Both Edwards and Whitehead watched the wreck, but didn't hear it land. After collecting themselves, they continued the run to Green River in peace. But as the journey came to an end, Edwards found a poorly scrawled message on the frosty glass of the engine's cab, reading, "A freight train was wrecked as you saw. Now that you saw it, you will never make another run. The engine was not under control and 4 section men were killed. If you ever run on this road again, you will be wrecked." Edwards understandably quit that morning and went to work for the Union Pacific. Other drivers reported seeing the ghost train chasing the Shavano, but this seems to be the only written account anyone made of it. Records indicate that no section men were killed on the line, but a train did wreck on the pass in 1888. Whether that was before or after this account of the story, I'm not too sure. The ghost train of Marshall Pass is certainly an interesting story. While most think of it as nothing more than another ghost train tale, the fact that the driver, fireman and conductor all witnessed the ghost catch up to them and subsequently derail does raise some questions. Was it really a ghost train they all saw that night? If so, who were the mystery engine crew and what would have happened if they caught up? Who knows? Just remember next time you're travelling through the mountains to take extra caution. Not because of the difficult terrain, but you never know if you might also have a ghost hot on your heels. Subscribe for more.